One of my favorite anecdotes involves the story of the astronomer who had a conversation with a theologian. And the astronomer said to the theologian, "There's something I can't figure out, why you theologians get all involved in technicalia, arguing and debating over predestination and infralapsarianism and superlapsarianism and all these technical things that the layperson doesn't care about at all. For me, religion is simple. It's the golden rule. It's do unto others as you would have others do unto you." The theologian thought for a second and he said, "You know, I think I understand exactly what you're saying because I have the same frustration with you astronomers. You're always dazzling us with this technical language about exploding novae and pulsating quasars and astronomical perturbations. Well, for me, astronomy's simple. It's twinkle, twinkle, little star." Well, we have people who want to keep theology extremely simple and also who want to make science extremely simple, when in reality, both of these spheres of investigation are extremely complex. And we're living in a time where there has arisen enormous respect for the scientific community. When we say that a problem is not difficult, but it's really simple, we don't say, this does not require a theologian to answer the question. We say, this isn't rocket science. Because in that expression, we are saying something about the sense of awe we have for contemporary science. Now, all of us are aware that in the age in which we live, there is this fierce sense of conflict between religion and science, which wasn't always the case, but it has certainly become the case, and we're dividing so often into rival camps, and there's a kind of distrust and suspicion that attends dialogue and discussion between the two groups, and that should not be the case. I, for one, have been interested in the development of the scientific enterprise, and I have to say I am nothing less than astonished at the achievements that have taken place in the field of the natural sciences. I would say, for example, I don't know the exact number, but anywhere between 95 and 99% of the people who are alive today in the United States of America have a higher standard of living than kings enjoyed 300 years ago. Even poor people in this country have the benefit of modern medicine to prolong their lives in times of illness and disease. They have the advantages of the electric light bulb, of indoor plumbing, of television sets, and all the rest. And if we step out of our own age and out of our own century and look at people's experience in the past and see the achievement of the human spirit and the whole scientific inquiry, we have to stand in awe. When I read the history of science and I look at the thinking of people like Newton and Kepler, Copernicus and Einstein, it seems to me that these men were almost superhuman. So brilliant were they in the theories that they developed and so on. Now, in the past, there was a kind of cooperative enterprise between theology and science. But the Copernican revolution and the conflict that emerged between the church and the scientific community drove a wedge between the two that has existed even to this day. But one of the things I want us to look at in this series are the ways in which the natural sciences and theology meet and have common interests and common goals and can be partners in a common venture. There are many things that science and theology have in common. And to begin with today, I want to look at a couple of these things that are very important in terms of commonality. And the first is this, that both theology and science are interested in salvation. Now, that may come as a surprise to you to consider the interest of science in salvation. Let me go even further and say that the bottom line is the ultimate quest of science is a question of salvation. But when I use the term salvation, as I apply it to science, I'm not using it in the customary way in which it is used in the case of religion or theology. In theology, when we talk about salvation, we talk about a person's reconciliation with God, the person's redemption of the individual soul that will live forever, and so on. And that is not the principal concern of the natural scientist. The natural scientist is interested in another kind of salvation, a kind of salvation that was articulated centuries ago, first of all, by the philosopher Plato. Now, I think we're all familiar to some degree with the work of this Athenian philosopher who wrestled in the Olympics, and because he had broad shoulders was called Plato. His father was given a parcel of land by a man whose name was Academe, and there were these olive groves out in the country, and Plato built his academy there in the groves of academia, from which we derived that concept even to this day. And at the entrance to his academy, he had these words posted on the door: "Let none but geometers enter here." Not quite the same inscription that was over the gateway to hell, according to Dante, where it's read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Plato said, "Let none but geometers enter here." And yet when we think of Plato and his academy, we think of it as a school for the discipline of philosophy, not the study of geometry, not the study of higher mathematics. So why does he have this inscription over the door? What Plato meant by a geometer was not somebody who was simply interested in one branch of higher mathematics, but he was interested in the concept of form, or what we would call formal truth. As a philosopher, he was interested in those concepts, those ideas, which somehow would make sense of all of the disparate elements of the material world that we encounter every day. He was looking behind matter for ultimate truth, for the ideals by which everything is to be understood. And so for him, geometry was a kind of philosophy. Now let me just add to that this idea that if you study the history of philosophy and the history of theology, you will see that over the centuries in the history of Western civilization, that some of the most important philosophers and some of the most important philosophical breakthroughs came from scholars who were not only philosophers, but were also mathematicians or involved in some other branch of natural science. You think, for example, of Spinoza, of Descartes. Both were mathematicians, as was Blaise Pascal. And then we think of Immanuel Kant, who is often considered the greatest titan of all in the history of philosophy, who also wrote in the field of astronomy and of physics. Because these men saw a unity between the material world and the world of ideas. They did not see philosophy and science as being in competition or in disjunction one from another. Well, again, back to the idea of salvation. For Plato, Plato's overarching concern, that which he described as the raison d'etre for all scientific inquiry and for all philosophical inquiry, was the task of the scholar to save the phenomena. To save the phenomena. Now, what in the world did he mean by that? We use this term phenomena in various ways. I may see something that strikes my fancy as being extremely unusual, extraordinary, or great, and I may say, for example, of Michael Jordan's basketball ability, he's phenomenal. And we use it as an adjective to describe greatness or that which is astonishing to us. But the root meaning of this word, phenomena, it's the plural form of the word phenomenon, which refers to those things which appear to the external senses. Anything that we perceive, anything that we see, anything that we hear or taste or touch or smell, anything that we encounter in the external physical world is all part of the phenomena of reality. Now, what Plato was interested in when he spoke of trying to save the phenomena was this. He said, as a scientist, as a philosopher, he was interested in coming up with a philosophical system or a theoretical system that could explain in a coherent way, in a rational way, all of the particulars of life as we experience it. This, he said, is the task of the scientist, to save the phenomena. That is, to make sense out of the world around us. Now, if you follow the history of cosmology and the history of science, you will see that in every generation there are changes in the theories that are dominant for the times, or what we would call the scientific paradigms or models of the moment. Sometimes these changes are gradual and seemingly minuscule and insignificant. Other times they're catastrophic and revolutionary. But what happens when the paradigm shift occurs is that a theory is constructed that better explains the phenomena. Now, we know that the perhaps greatest scientific revolution, certainly the one that brought the greatest upheaval, was what was called the Copernican revolution that took place in the 16th century. And this was a revolution in the field of cosmology and astronomy. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, indeed, almost 2,000 years, all scientists worked within the framework of the same idea, which idea was called Geo Centricity. The idea that the Earth is the center not only of the solar system in which we live, but that the Earth is the center of the entire universe. This gave enormous dignity to man, because we like to think of ourselves as being at the center of the stage of this vast, expansive universe. And then along came Copernicus, who challenged that idea and said, no, the sun is the center of the solar system and not the Earth. And voila, we were off to the races in terms of fierce controversy and debate. We know the Galileo episode, which gave a black eye to the church, which still shines as a shiner even to this day. We remember the story of bishops who refused to look through the lens of Galileo's telescope because they were convinced that his theory had to be wrong, because in their judgment the Bible taught unambiguously that the Earth is the center of the universe and not the sun or of the solar system. We also have to remember that Galileo got just as much grief from the astronomers of his day as he did from the bishops. Well, how did this all happen? Well, it goes back to the period of Aristotle, Alexander the Great, and a man by the name of Ptolemy, who developed the old ancient system of astronomy that we call Geo Centricity, and he considered the Earth as the center of everything, and that the sky is like a crystal canopy over the Earth. And there are stars, or these luminaries, that are fixed to this invisible glass dome. Now, they have some movement, but it's regular and predictable and so on because they're on these circular spheres that are interconnected. The big problem, of course, that Ptolemy had was with the wanderers, the wandering stars that were called planets, because the word planet meant wanderer. And in order to account for these wanderings of the stars, he had to construct an extremely complicated, intricate system of crystalline spheres that overlap with each other and so on in order to save the phenomena. In order to be able to predict with accuracy the movements of the heavenly bodies, which was not simply a matter of academic curiosity, but was a matter literally of life and death. Because how the stars were read determined seasons for planting and the harvesting of crops, not to mention systems of navigation that followed the stars. And so he came up with this mathematically cumbersome system by which eclipses could be predicted, the phases of the moon could be predicted, and so on. And it worked. And it worked for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. His system saved the phenomenon. Then along comes Copernicus, and he challenges this and says, no, the Earth is the center of the solar system. Now, one of the ironies of history is in the first system that Copernicus developed, it didn't work as well as Ptolemy's system. It was less cumbersome, more simple mathematically, but not as accurate in terms of predictability. It took some very important adjustments later by Kepler, who solved the problem of retrograde motion with Mars and with the problem of the orbiting paths of planets, showing that they were elliptical rather than perfectly circular, and so on. But the point is, this system endured not simply because of prejudice for so many centuries, but it endured because it worked. It saved the phenomena in a practical way. Now, what happens is, as we learn more about the world around ourselves, we have little details, particular items that we come to know of, and they don't fit into our system. They don't fit the paradigm. And what do we call those? We call them anomalies. Anomalies are data bits of phenomena that don't fit the current system of thought. And if they become irritating enough and pesky enough, they begin to raise questions about the whole structure. And this is how the structures tend to change. If you get enough anomalies, then people begin to challenge the assumptions of earlier systems and earlier paradigms until some creative thinker comes along and comes up with a new theory. Now, these theories today tend to change with almost kaleidoscopic rapidity, partly because of the knowledge explosion that we're going through today. When I look back at the high school physics books, the high school physics book that I had to read as a senior in high school, and look at some of the established theories that were recorded there, we are amused because nobody holds these theories anymore. But in any case, we share a common pursuit here, a pursuit of salvation, a pursuit of making sense out of the world in which we live. The second thing that I want to mention in passing that we have in common is that we are both studying the sphere of nature. And historic theology teaches that God reveals himself not only in the Bible, but there is also what we call a general revelation, a revelation that God makes of himself through the medium of nature. Now, I often ask my seminary students this. I say, do you believe that the Bible is infallible? And most of them say yes. I say, well, do you believe that general revelation is infallible? And they scratch their heads and they look at me with a kind of look of bewilderment. And I say, why the hesitation? The only reason you believe the Bible is infallible is because you believe its author is God. You don't believe that human beings are infallible. And I say, who's the author of general revelation? It's the same author. And so I'll be proceeding in this brief course following the conviction of men like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who operated with this assumption, that all truth is God's truth, and that all truth meets at the top. Augustine once made the comment that every Christian should seek to learn as much as he or she possibly could about as many things as they possibly can. Because if it is true, it points to God. And the Christian should not be afraid of truth in any sphere of investigation, whether it's a study of Scripture or a study of nature. Both are spheres of revelation of God, and so the scientific enterprise can be and has been again and again an enormous benefit, an enormous boon to the church. There have been times when the discoveries of science has corrected the theology of the church and has embarrassed the church. There are times when theology is a corrective on science. Neither the scientist nor the theologian is infallible. Both of us must be humble before the phenomena.